Have you ever wondered what happens after a picture-perfect marriage to a powerful man shatters into a million pieces? What happens when you're cast aside, labeled as nothing more than a pretty accessory, while your ex-husband's star continues to rise? For one woman, a night meant to celebrate the city's most generous souls turned into a public trial. Her billionaire ex-husband was ready to mock her, to humiliate her in front of everyone who mattered. But he made one critical mistake. He completely underestimated her new husband. In a room dripping with wealth and power, the quietest man held the biggest secret, and he was about to steal the spotlight in the most spectacular way imaginable. Leora Marshall adjusted the delicate sapphire earring, her reflection in the full-length mirror, a stranger she was still getting to know. The woman staring back was poised, her simple, elegant navy gown a testament to understated class rather than overt wealth. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her eyes held memories, memories of a different life, a different mirror, a different Leora. That Leora had been Mrs. Richard Sterling. For 10 years, she had been the wife of the real estate titan Richard Sterling, a man whose name was etched in gold on skyscrapers that clawed at the New York skyline. Their life was a whirlwind of camera flashes, exclusive parties, and front-page features in magazines that celebrated wealth as the highest virtue. Richard had not married a partner. He had acquired a masterpiece. He chose her gowns, curated her friends, and sculpted her opinions until the woman she once was became a faint, polished echo. He loved showcasing her, his millennial Grace Kelly, as one magazine had dubbed her. But in the quiet, cavernous halls of their Park Avenue penthouse, the applause faded, and his words became stones, chipping away at her worth. "You're an artist, darling. How quaint," he'd once sneered when he found her sketching in a forgotten corner of the library. "Stick to being beautiful. It's what you do best. It's what I pay for." The divorce had been brutal. Richard, with his army of ruthless lawyers, painted her as a gold digger, a vapid socialite who was ungrateful for the kingdom he had bestowed upon her. He ensured she walked away with just enough to be comfortable, but not enough to be powerful. It was a calculated move, designed to keep her in his shadow, a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to leave his orbit. For the first year, she had nearly drowned in the silence and the sudden anonymity. The society that had once adored her now looked through her, seeing only the discarded wife of a more important man. Then she met Liam. Liam Thorne was everything Richard was not. He was a history professor at Columbia University, a man who found joy in dusty books and quiet Sunday morning spent at the farmer's market. He was tall and kind, with thoughtful gray eyes that saw her, not the former Mrs. Sterling, but Leora, the woman who loved the smell of old paper, who could lose herself for hours in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and who still dreamed of painting. He didn't try to fix her. He simply gave her the space to heal. He listened. He encouraged her to pick up her charcoal pencils again. He celebrated the small victories, her first gallery submission, her first sale of a small piece to a local collector. With him, she wasn't an accessory. She was the entire exhibition. "Are you ready?" Liam's voice, warm and steady, pulled her from her reverie. He stood in the doorway of their cozy Upper West Side apartment, a world away from the cold marble of her previous life. He looked handsome in a classic, well-fitted tuxedo that was likely older than some of Richard's companies. He wasn't trying to command the room, just to be present in it. "As I'll ever be," she sighed, turning to face him. "Liam, are you sure about this? The Metropolitan Children's Foundation Gala it's Richard's playground. He's the event chair this year." Liam walked over and took her hands, his touch grounding her. "Which is exactly why we're going. You have spent 2 years rebuilding your life, Mia. You are on the junior board of this foundation because you care about the work they do, not because of who you were married to. You will not let him scare you away from your own life. I'll be right there with you." She leaned into him, breathing in the comforting scent of his cologne. "He'll be awful. You know he will. He'll see your tweed and elbow patches professor's salary as a personal insult to his net worth." A gentle smile played on Liam's lips. "Then let him be awful. His opinion is of no consequence to me, or to you. Not anymore." She knew he was right, but the knot of anxiety in her stomach was a stubborn thing. Tonight, she wouldn't just be Leora Marshall, artist and philanthropist. To everyone in that ballroom, she would be Richard Sterling's ex-wife, arriving with her quiet, unassuming new husband. It was a narrative Richard would relish, and he would use it to try and destroy her all over again. The grand ballroom at the plaza was a breathtaking spectacle of gilded opulence and cascading crystals. The air hummed with the quiet, confident buzz of New York's elite. Old money and new, tech moguls and media barons, all mingling under the soft glow of the chandeliers. For Leora, it felt less like a party and more like stepping back into the lion's den she had fought so hard to escape. She kept her hand firmly on Liam's arm, his solid presence her only anchor in a sea of familiar, judgmental faces. Whispers followed them like the rustle of silk gowns. She could feel the stares, the tilted heads, the silent conversations happening behind champagne flutes. There's Leora Sterling. Well, Marshall now. Look at her dress, so simple. And who is that with her? They found their table, thankfully situated away from the main stage, but still very much in the thick of it. Leora exchanged pleasantries with the other junior board members at their table, her smile feeling brittle and thin. And then a hush fell over the room, a subtle shift in energy that signaled the arrival of royalty. Richard Sterling made his entrance. He didn't just walk into a room, he conquered it. Flanked by his new girlfriend, a model half his age with diamonds sparkling at her throat, he moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the world and knew it. He was laughing, a booming sound that commanded attention, his hand possessively on the small of his companion's back. His eyes, the color of cold steel, swept the room, and then they found her. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. He excused himself from his group and began to weave his way through the tables, making a direct line for them. Leora's heart hammered against her ribs. "He's coming over," she whispered, her voice tight. "Breathe, Mia," Liam said softly, his hand covering hers on the table. "Just breathe." Richard stopped before their table, casting a long, imposing shadow. He completely ignored Liam, his gaze fixed on Leora, raking over her with blatant disdain. "Leora, darling," he began, his voice dripping with condescending charm. "I have to admit, I'm surprised to see you here. I thought your budget might not stretch to a table at this particular event. Or did you get a pity invitation from the board?" Leora stiffened, her cheeks burning with humiliation. "Hello, Richard. The board invited me because, unlike you, I actually volunteer my time with the children this foundation helps." Richard chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. "Of course, your little art therapy classes. Very noble. Very insignificant." His eyes finally flickered to Liam, dismissing him in a single glance. He didn't even offer a handshake. "And you must be the replacement. The professor, isn't it? Richard Sterling." He said his own name like it was a title. "Tell me, Professor, what's the going rate for tenure these days? I hope for Lyra's sake it at least covers the rent." Liam met Richard's gaze without flinching. His expression was calm, almost unnervingly so. "It's Dr. Thorne, and we do just fine, thank you." The simple, polite response seemed to infuriate Richard more than any angry retort could have. He wanted a fight, a reaction. He wanted Liam to look small and intimidated. Instead, Liam looked bored. "Dr. Thorne," Richard scoffed, drawing out the title as if it were a joke. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper meant for the whole table to hear. "You know, I built an entire wing of a hospital that's probably bigger than your university department. Men like me, we change the world. We build things. What do you do? Talk about dead kings and forgotten wars to children who can't wait to check their phones?" He straightened up, his smirk returning. "Enjoy the party. Try the salmon. It's the most expensive thing on the menu. My treat." With a final, pitying look at Leora, he turned and glided away, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. The other people at their table suddenly found their napkins intensely interesting. The public humiliation was complete. Leora felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, the familiar shame washing over her. Richard hadn't just insulted her and Liam. He had reminded everyone in the room of her place in his world, a footnote in his grand, important life. She looked at Liam, expecting to see anger or embarrassment. Instead, he simply squeezed her hand and gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Well," Liam said, his voice perfectly even, "that was unpleasant." And then he picked up his water glass and took a calm, deliberate sip, as if Richard Sterling were nothing more than a fly buzzing briefly around their table. The sheer, unbothered tranquility of it was, in its own way, an act of defiance more powerful than any curse word. But the night was young, and Richard Sterling was just getting started. After the dinner plates were cleared, the main event began. The live auction. This was Richard's true stage. It wasn't just about raising money for the children. It was a public performance of power, a gladiatorial contest where net worths were brandished like swords. As the event chair, Richard took to the stage to kick things off. "Thank you all for coming," he boomed into the microphone, his image projected onto massive screens on either side of the stage. "Tonight, we are here for the children, children who need our help. And as someone who has always believed in going big, I want to start this night off with a bang." He paused for dramatic effect. "The Sterling Foundation is pleased to pledge $10 million to kickstart our fundraising goal." The room erupted in thunderous applause, cameras flashed. Richard soaked it in, a benevolent king accepting the adoration of his subjects. Leora felt a familiar nausea. Richard's charity was never about generosity. It was about branding. His donations were investments in his own legacy. The auction began with smaller items: luxury vacations, designer jewelry, walk-on roles in blockbuster films. Richard bid on several, winning a vintage Patek Philippe watch for a staggering sum, each win punctuated by a smug nod to the crowd. Finally, the centerpiece item was unveiled. It was a large, breathtakingly beautiful painting. It was an abstract piece, a swirl of deep blues and vibrant golds, full of raw emotion and kinetic energy. The auctioneer introduced it. "And now for our final item of the evening. This is Ascension, an original work by the incredibly talented emerging artist A.H. Wallace. Wallace has chosen to remain anonymous, but has burst onto the art scene this year, with critics hailing their work as the future of abstract expressionism. The artist has generously donated this piece, with a starting bid of $100,000. Leora's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the painting, her heart pounding. No one in this room knew, not even Liam. A.H. Wallace was the pseudonym she had adopted for her professional work. Wallace was her mother's maiden name. Ascension was her soul on a canvas, a depiction of her own painful, beautiful journey out of the darkness of her past. Richard, who had once called her art an insignificant hobby, was about to watch his peers bid on her work. The irony was so thick she could taste it. $100,000, a voice called out. $150, another countered. The bidding quickly escalated. $200,000, $300. It was a testament to the hype surrounding the mysterious artist. Richard watched with a pleased expression, as a high sale price would reflect well on his gala. The bidding stalled at $450,000. The auctioneer began his final call. "Going once, going twice. $500,000, Richard's voice boomed from his table near the stage. He hadn't bid yet, clearly waiting to make a grand final gesture. He wanted to own the most talked-about piece of the night. A murmur went through the crowd. The auctioneer beamed. $500,000 from Mr. Sterling. Leora felt sick. The idea of Richard owning this piece, of him hanging her soul on his wall as another trophy, was unbearable. "Going once. $600,000, a calm, clear voice said from the back of the room. It was a man Leora didn't recognize, holding up paddle number 217. Richard's head snapped in the direction of the bid. His brow furrowed. He raised his paddle without hesitation. $750,000. He was ending this now. $800,000, came the immediate reply from paddle 217. A tense hush fell over the ballroom. This was no longer just an auction, it was a duel. All eyes darted between Richard, the known titan, and the mysterious bidder at the back. $1 million, Richard said, his voice cold and hard. He stood up slightly, asserting his dominance. The message was clear. I will not be outbid. The room held its breath. The man with paddle 217 leaned over and whispered something to an associate, who nodded. He then raised his paddle one last time. $2 million. The sound that rippled through the room was a collective gasp. It was an audacious, almost absurd jump in bidding. It wasn't about the art anymore. It was a statement. Richard Sterling stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly hardened into fury. He had been publicly challenged and defeated. To bid again would look desperate. To back down was to admit defeat. He slowly, stiffly sat back down. His jaw was clenched so tight Leora could see the muscle throbbing from across the room. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel down. "To paddle number 217 for $2 million. The ballroom erupted into applause and excited chatter. Who was this mysterious bidder with such deep pockets and nerves of steel? As the lights came up slightly, Leora watched as the man with paddle 217 stood and made his way not to the stage to claim his prize, but directly toward their table. He walked past the curious stares and stopped directly in front of Liam. He handed the paddle to him. "As requested, Dr. Thorne," the man said with a respectful nod. "The acquisition is complete. The painting is yours." Leora stared, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She turned to Liam, her eyes wide with a million questions. Liam simply took the paddle from his associate, placed it gently on the table, and turned to her. "I know how much your work means to you," he said softly, his gray eyes holding hers. "I wasn't going to let him have it." The full weight of the moment crashed down on her. Liam, her quiet academic husband, had just spent $2 million on her painting. He had done it silently from the shadows, and in doing so, he had publicly humiliated the man who thought his money made him invincible. The question wasn't just how, it was who was she married to. The air around their table crackled with a new kind of energy. The whispers were no longer about Leora the ex-wife, but about the quiet man beside her. People stared openly now, their expressions a mixture of confusion, awe, and frantic recalculation. Who was Dr. Liam Thorne? A history professor who could casually drop $2 million at a charity auction was not a character they recognized in their carefully ordered universe. Leora's own mind was a whirlwind. "Liam, how?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling slightly. $2 million? That's impossible." Before Liam could answer, a woman approached their table. It was Catherine Blackwood, the elegant, silver-haired matriarch of one of New York's oldest families and the president of the Metropolitan Children's Foundation. Her face, usually a mask of polite reserve, was lit with a genuine, brilliant smile. "Liam," she said, her voice warm with affection. She completely ignored the stunned onlookers. "I should have known you couldn't resist a good bidding war. You always did love the theater of it all." She turned her warm eyes to Leora. "My dear, that was quite a moment. And what a magnificent painting. You must be so proud." Leora could only nod, speechless. Catherine Blackwood was speaking to Liam with the familiar ease of an old friend, a co-conspirator. Richard, watching from his table, could bear it no longer. His ego, battered and bruised, propelled him to his feet. He strode toward them, his face a thunderous mask of rage. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. He wasn't speaking to Liam, but to Catherine. "Who is this man? Is this some kind of joke?" Catherine Blackwood's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of icy disapproval. "Richard, I suggest you lower your voice. You are making a scene. I am the chair of this event. I raised more money tonight than anyone in this room, and I demand to know what's going on," he snarled. Catherine looked at Liam, a silent question in her eyes. Liam gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to grow, to fill the space with a quiet authority that dwarfed Richard's loud aggression. "It's all right, Catherine," Liam said, his voice calm but resonant, carrying a new weight. He turned to face Richard. For the first time all night, he looked at the billionaire not as a man to be endured, but as an object of mild curiosity. "You asked me what I do, Richard," Liam began, his tone even and academic, as if he were beginning a lecture. "You seem to believe that the only value in this world is measured in dollars and stock portfolios. It's a common misconception among men who build their empires on concrete and steel." He gestured vaguely at the opulent ballroom. "My family has been in this city for a very long time. We didn't build skyscrapers. We built libraries. We endowed universities. We funded the museums that you and your friends only visit when there's a gala with photographers. A dawning horror began to creep into Richard's eyes as the pieces began to click into place. The name Thorne. It wasn't a common name in the city's philanthropic circles, but it was a legendary one. Catherine Blackwood stepped forward, her voice clear and ringing with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the silent watching room, "for many years the driving force behind our foundation has been a family that has always preferred to do its work quietly, without fanfare or recognition. The family that founded this very organization over a century ago." She smiled and placed a hand on Liam's arm. "Tonight, I think it's time we properly thank our chairman of the board. Please allow me to introduce you to Dr. Liam Thorne of the Thorne Philanthropic Trust." The name hit the room like a shockwave. The Thorne Trust. It was a near mythical entity, a colossal old money foundation with an endowment so vast it made Richard Sterling's fortune look like pocket change. They were famously anonymous, their grants and donations appearing as if by magic to save struggling orchestras, fund groundbreaking medical research, and support countless charities like this one. They never put their name on buildings. They never sought the spotlight. Their power was of a different kind, older, deeper, and far more respected than Richard's flashy new money. Liam Thorne wasn't just a history professor, he was the silent kingmaker of New York's entire cultural and charitable landscape. He was the man whose calls were always taken, whose favor was sought by mayors and museum directors alike. He was everything Richard Sterling pretended to be. Richard stood, utterly poleaxed. His face had gone from red with fury to a sickly, ashen white. He was the event chair of a gala for a foundation run by the very man he had just mocked as a broke academic. He had tried to buy a painting, only to be outbid by an order of magnitude by the man whose family probably owned the entire auction house. The spotlight he had so desperately craved was now shining, hot and unforgiving, on his own spectacular public ignorance. The transfer of power in the room was absolute and instantaneous. The magnetic pull that had surrounded Richard Sterling all evening vanished, dissipating like smoke. The new center of gravity was the calm, unassuming man in the simple tuxedo. People who had been clamoring for a word with Richard just an hour ago now pretended he didn't exist. They began to drift toward Liam and Leora's table, their faces alight with newfound interest and deference. Liam, however, seemed entirely unfazed by the attention. His focus was solely on Leora. He took her hand, his thumb gently tracing circles on her skin. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for her. She was still reeling, trying to reconcile the man who made her pancakes on Sunday mornings with the philanthropic heavyweight who had just been unveiled. "You run this foundation? The Thorne Trust? Why didn't you tell me?" "It's not something I lead with," he said with a small, self-deprecating smile. "I fell in love with Leora Marshall, the brilliant artist, not the former Mrs. Sterling. I didn't want my family's history to cast a shadow over our life, the way his money cast a shadow over yours. It's my work, Mia. It's not who I am. You are who I am." His words cut through the shock, grounding her in the beautiful truth of their relationship. He hadn't hidden it to deceive her. He had hidden it to protect her, to allow her to see him and love him for himself. Catherine Blackwood, sensing the need for a formal conclusion to the evening, moved to the stage and tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice silencing the murmurs, "on behalf of the Metropolitan Children's Foundation and on behalf of our chairman, Dr. Liam Thorne, I want to thank you for your incredible generosity tonight. You have raised a record-breaking amount for the children of the city." The applause was thunderous, but this time, it wasn't for Richard. It was for Liam. Catherine continued, "Dr. Thorne has always preferred to let the work speak for itself, but tonight he has agreed to say a few words." Liam looked at Leora, a silent question in his eyes. She squeezed his hand, her own fear and anxiety now replaced by a fierce, soaring pride. "Go," she whispered. "They need to hear from you." Liam made his way to the stage. He didn't stride with Richard's arrogance, but walked with a quiet, confident purpose. He stood at the podium, a stark contrast to Richard's earlier performance. He didn't preen or posture. He just looked out at the sea of faces, his gaze calm and direct. "Thank you, Catherine," he began, his voice clear and steady, the voice of a professor used to commanding the attention of a lecture hall. "My great-grandmother helped start this foundation because she believed in a simple idea, that a city's greatness is not measured by the height of its buildings, but by how it cares for its most vulnerable." He didn't look at Richard, but the entire room felt the weight of his words. "Generosity isn't a competition," he continued. "It is not a performance. It is not about putting your name on a wall. It is about quietly, steadfastly, and compassionately building a better world. It's about funding the teacher who stays late to help a struggling student. It's about ensuring a child has a warm meal and a safe place to sleep. It is about seeing the value in things that have no price tag, like art that moves the soul." As he said this, his eyes found Leora in the crowd. A soft, genuine smile touched his lips, a private message in a public forum. "True wealth," he concluded, "is not what you accumulate. It's what you give away. It's the love you share, the community you build, and the hope you inspire. My wife, Leora, inspires me every day with her compassion, her resilience, and her incredible talent. She is the epitome of that spirit. Thank you all for sharing in that spirit tonight." He finished his short, powerful speech and walked off the stage to a standing ovation. The applause was not the polite, obligatory clapping from before. It was a roar of genuine respect and admiration. He had not only stolen the spotlight, he had redefined what it meant to be powerful in that room. He had replaced the vulgarity of wealth with the quiet dignity of purpose. As he returned to the table, he was mobbed. The mayor, a United States senator, the director of the Met, they all wanted a word with Dr. Thorne, and by his side they saw Leora not as an appendage, but as the muse and partner he had just publicly declared her to be. She was no longer Richard Sterling's ex-wife. She was Leora Marshall, the wife of Liam Thorne, a woman of substance and significance in her own right. Across the room, Richard Sterling sat alone at his table. His new girlfriend had discreetly moved to another group. The people who had surrounded him all night now avoided his gaze. He was a king in an empty court, his $10 million pledge suddenly feeling like a cheap, desperate cry for attention. He had been mocked, not with insults, but with class. He had been defeated, not with anger, but with grace. And the woman he had tried to break was now at the center of the universe, shining brighter than he had ever allowed her to. The end of the gala was not a sudden affair, but a slow, deliberate unwinding of the night's tension. The air, once thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the pressure of social maneuvering, was now filled with the singular, buzzing topic of conversation: the fall of Richard Sterling and the rise of the unknown Dr. Thorne. It was a seismic shift in the city's power dynamics, and everyone in the room was a witness, eager to dissect the tremor. Leora and Liam became an island in a swirling sea of influence. A queue of the city's most powerful figures formed organically near their table, each person waiting for a moment of audience. Mayor Thompson, who had given Richard a hearty slap on the back earlier in the evening, now approached Liam with a deferential stoop. He spoke of urban renewal projects, of educational initiatives, his words a thinly veiled plea for the Thorne Trust's attention. He addressed Leora with a newfound respect, asking about her artistic vision for the city's public spaces. She answered with a confidence that felt both new and entirely natural. Then came a revered art critic from the New York Review of Books, a man whose opinion could make or break careers. He had always ignored Leora's submissions to group shows. Tonight, he praised the extraordinary emotional depth of Ascension, calling it a masterpiece of neoclassical expressionism. He didn't just see a painting, he saw the artist, now publicly endorsed by a man of immense cultural capital. Through it all, Liam remained the calm center of the storm. He deflected praise with academic humility, redirected conversations about funding to his foundation's formal processes, and consistently, subtly, brought every conversation back to Leora. "You should really speak to my wife about this," he would say. "Her insight into community arts programs is far more valuable than mine." He was not just sharing the spotlight, he was angling it directly onto her, ensuring everyone understood they were partners. Across the grand ballroom, Richard Sterling watched this scene unfold from his self-imposed exile. He sat at his table, now conspicuously empty. His model girlfriend had vanished 20 minutes ago, pleading a headache but really fleeing the radioactive zone of his failure. He nursed a glass of scotch, the amber liquid doing nothing to warm the ice that had formed in his veins. He watched the man he'd called a replacement hold court with senators and CEOs. He watched the woman he had molded and discarded become the toast of the very society he sought to dominate. In his mind, a furious, narcissistic narrative was taking shape. This was a setup, a conspiracy. Leora, the cunning, ungrateful creature, must have orchestrated this entire charade. She had weaponized this quiet, dusty academic, using his hidden legacy to stage this elaborate, public revenge. The thought that he had been undone not by a rival titan, but by his own colossal arrogance, was an impossibility his ego could not entertain. He needed a confrontation. He needed to reassert the narrative, to regain control, to have the last cutting word. Fueled by scotch and raw fury, he pushed himself to his feet and began the long, lonely walk across the floor. The crowd parted for him, a silent, damning corridor opening up between his table and theirs. The whispers followed him, a wave of pity and morbid curiosity. When he finally reached them, blocking their path to the grand staircase, the remaining conversations in the room died out. The final act was about to play out. "I want a word," he said, his voice a low growl, stripped of its earlier, charming veneer. Liam, who had been shaking the hand of a university president, turned slowly. He positioned himself slightly, almost imperceptibly, in front of Leora. It wasn't an aggressive move, but a definitive one, a shield. "I think you've said quite enough for one evening, Richard." "Not with you," Richard spat, his eyes burning with a hateful intensity as he locked his gaze on Leora. He was ignoring Liam, a desperate final attempt to treat him as insignificant. "With her." He took a menacing step closer, the smell of expensive whiskey sharp on his breath. "Was this your plan all along? All those years playing the dutiful, simple little wife? Were you plotting this? To find some dusty old money relic in a library and use him to humiliate me? It's a clever move, I'll give you that. You always were more cunning than you let on." The accusation hung in the silent air. The Richard she knew would have expected her to flinch, to cry, to deny it weakly. But that Leora was gone. She looked at the man she had once feared, the man whose moods had dictated the weather of her entire world, and she felt a profound, liberating clarity. The power he wielded was an illusion she had been conditioned to believe in. She stepped out from behind Liam's protective stance, not in defiance of him, but in assertion of herself. She met Richard's furious gaze with an unnerving calm. Her voice when she spoke was not loud, but it carried across the silent space with the resonance of absolute truth. "There was no plan, Richard," she said, her tone even and cool. "And that is what you will never understand. You see the world as a series of calculated moves, of acquisitions and leveraged attacks. You cannot fathom that something like this could happen simply because you were cruel and someone else was kind." She took a small step toward him, closing the distance he had created. "You did this to yourself. You are so blinded by the golden reflection in your own skyscrapers that you are incapable of seeing the world or the people in it for what they truly are. You looked at Liam and saw a poor professor because his worth isn't displayed on a stock ticker. You looked at me and saw a failure because I no longer served as your accessory. You saw what you wanted to see, Richard, what your ego needed you to see. That is your prison, not my strategy." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the profound silence of the room. "You think this night was about you, about humiliating you. You think you are the sun around which every story orbits. But you're not. This night was about raising millions of dollars for children who need life-saving care. It was about celebrating a beautiful piece of art that came from a place of pain and recovery. And for me," her voice softened as she glanced at Liam, a world of love passing between them in a single look. "It was about being here, free and unafraid, with the man I love. A man who values my thoughts more than my appearance, and who finds strength in kindness, not cruelty, a concept you could never comprehend." She held his gaze for a final, piercing moment. "We have nothing more to discuss. Not tonight, not ever. Her finality was a door slamming shut on a decade of her life. Without waiting for a response, she turned her back on him, a simple, devastating gesture of dismissal. She took Liam's arm and together, they began to walk toward the exit. The crowd watched them go. Then slowly the spell broke, and the buzz of conversation returned, now laced with the finality of Richard's defeat. He was left standing alone, a monument to his own irrelevance, the ghost at a feast that had long since moved on. The walk out of the plaza and into the crisp autumn air felt like emerging from a deep-sea dive. Leora took a breath, the cool air filling her lungs, feeling cleaner and lighter than the recycled atmosphere of the gala. The ride home in the quiet town car was a gentle decompression. She rested her head on Liam's shoulder as the vibrant, indifferent lights of New York City blurred past the window. "He really thought I planned it," she murmured, the absurdity of it settling in. "He thinks I'm some kind of evil genius." Liam chuckled softly, his arm tightening around her. He can't imagine a world that doesn't revolve around him. To him, there are only two roles to play, his or his victims. The idea of you simply being happy without him is a reality he cannot process. He turned to look at her, his expression tender. "That's why I never told you about the trust. I saw how his money had been a cage for you. I was terrified that mine, however different its history, would feel like another. I needed you to know that my life, the one that truly matters to me, is the one I have with you in our apartment, surrounded by your art and my books. The rest is just inherited administration." "It's more than that," she said, sitting up to face him, her eyes shining in the passing lights. "Tonight, you used it to protect me. You used it to give my work a platform. You used it to turn something ugly into something beautiful. It's not a cage, Liam. With you, it's a key." When they arrived back at their apartment building, the doorman tipped his hat with a new knowing smile. Their apartment was a sanctuary of warm light and familiar comforts. The grand opulence of the gala felt a world away. Here, there were canvases leaning against the walls, half-finished sketches on the coffee table, and stacks of books that threatened to overtake the furniture. It was messy, it was real, it was theirs. Leora kicked off her heels with a sigh of relief. Liam loosened his bow tie. He went to a small, unassuming cabinet and returned not with a priceless vintage, but with a simple bottle of champagne he'd been saving. As he popped the cork with a festive thud, the sound echoed in the quiet room, a definitive punctuation mark on the end of an era. "I believe," he said, his eyes sparkling as he poured two glasses, "we have something to celebrate." He handed her a flute. "To A.H. Wallace, an artist whose work is not only critically acclaimed, but has also proven to be a remarkably effective tool for dismantling colossal egos." Leora laughed, a full, joyous sound that was utterly her own. She clinked her glass against his. This was her victory, not the sight of Richard's public downfall, but this feeling, the quiet contentment, the shared joke, the profound peace of being truly seen and loved for exactly who she was. She had walked into that gala as a ghost from Richard Sterling's past. She was walking into the rest of her life as herself, finally and completely. The morning after the gala, the city awoke to a story far more compelling than any corporate merger or political scandal. It was a story of human drama, a perfectly constructed narrative of hubris and comeuppance that the New York media machine devoured with relish. By 9 a.m., it was the only thing anyone was talking about. The coverage was a multi-front assault on Richard Sterling's carefully constructed image. The society pages were dripping with delicious scorn. The Daily Post's most feared columnist, a woman named Beatrice Black, led her column with the headline, "King Richard Dethroned at His Own Ball." She wrote, "For years, Richard Sterling has operated under the assumption that his checkbook was a scepter. Last night, in a breathtaking turn of events, a quiet academic reminded him, and all of us, that true royalty doesn't need to announce itself. Sterling didn't just lose a bidding war, he lost the room, his dignity, and quite possibly his crown." More seriously, the financial press took a colder, more analytical view. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece on its business page titled, "The Sterling Brand When Ego Becomes a Liability." It questioned the stability of a CEO whose public persona was so deeply intertwined with personal dominance. The article quoted an anonymous source from the Gala, a fellow titan of industry, who said, "Business is about partnerships and perception. After last night, who would want to partner with that kind of volatile arrogance?" He didn't just get angry, he got small. For Richard, the fallout was not an abstract news cycle. It was a series of swift, brutal, and concrete consequences. He was sitting in his cavernous, minimalist office on the 80th floor of Sterling Tower, the silence broken only by the hum of the air filtration system. His phone, a device usually buzzing with a relentless stream of calls and texts, was dead silent. He had already fired his PR chief for failing to kill the story. At 10:15 a.m., an email landed in his inbox. It was from the office of George Vanderbilt III, the patriarch of the family-run investment firm that was the primary partner in his new downtown luxury condominium project. The Vanderbilt family was the epitome of old money, with deep ties to the city's cultural institutions they now knew were largely funded by the Thorne Trust. The email was icily brief and formal. It cited a clause in their contract regarding brand integrity and public conduct, and formally announced the withdrawal of their 9-figure investment, effective immediately. Richard stared at the screen, his blood running cold. It was a catastrophic blow, but it was the postscript that twisted the knife. PM, it read, "Catherine Blackwood is my sister. Perhaps you should have considered that." He leaned back in his leather chair, the entire city of New York sprawling beneath him like a kingdom that was no longer his. The foundation of his empire, built on the perception of being the biggest, most formidable man in any room, had developed a catastrophic crack. Meanwhile, in a cozy Upper West Side apartment, the atmosphere was the mirror opposite. Leora's phone had been ringing since 8 a.m. The first call was from the Gagosian Gallery, a name so prestigious she had never even dared to dream of submitting her portfolio there. They wanted to discuss exclusive representation. The second was from the curator of the Whitney Museum of American Art, inquiring about the possibility of acquiring a piece from her Ascension series for their permanent collection. Emails flooded her inbox from collectors, critics, and journalists, all clamoring for a piece of the mysterious A.H. Wallace. Liam watched her, a proud, happy smile on his face as he handed her another cup of coffee. "It seems the art world has finally woken up," he said. "It's overwhelming," she confessed, her head spinning. "A week ago, I couldn't get a gallery owner to return my calls." "They weren't just seeing your art before," Liam said gently. "They were seeing the narrative Richard created for you. Now they're seeing your narrative, and it's a much more compelling story." His words resonated deeply. Her new fame wasn't just a byproduct of his identity. It was a result of her story, her resilience, being thrust into the light. A few days later, she accepted a formal position that Liam had wanted to offer her for months, Director of Arts and Cultural Development for the Thorne Trust. Her first act was not to fund a grand opera or a museum expansion, but to draft and approve a multi-million-dollar grant to provide art supplies and mentorship programs to public schools in the city's most underserved boroughs. She was taking the power she now had and immediately directing it to the places and people who had none. A direct inversion of Richard's philosophy of power for power's sake. 6 months later, they stood on a cordoned-off patch of earth on the grounds of Mount Sinai Hospital. It was a bright, chilly spring day, and they were at the groundbreaking ceremony for the new Ascension Pediatric Oncology Wing. The $2 million from the auction, which the Thorne Trust had matched, had fully funded its construction. As Leora stood listening to the hospital's director speak about the hope the new facility would bring, she felt a profound sense of circularity. She thought of the painting itself, conceived in the lonely silence of her post-divorce apartment, an expression of her own climb out of a dark place. It had then become a public spectacle, a weapon in a war of egos she never wanted to fight. Now its journey was ending here. Its value, once measured in dollars during a vulgar bidding war, had been transmuted into something priceless, a place of healing for sick children. It was the ultimate reclamation of her work, of her story. Richard had tried to own her soul on a canvas, and that very act had resulted in a legacy of compassion that would bear no one's name, but would touch countless lives. That evening, they were curled up on the sofa in their apartment, a comfortable silence between them. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the room. Liam was reading a worn, leather-bound book on the history of Renaissance Florence. He looked up from the page, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It's fascinating," he began, "when you truly study families like the Medici. They were ruthless bankers. By the standards of their day, they were the Richard Sterlings of Florence. But nobody today remembers their banking innovations or the rivals they crushed. We remember them for the art they commissioned, for funding the architecture and the ideas that shaped the next 500 years. They secured their immortality not through the wealth they hoarded, but through the beauty they enabled." Leora leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the flames dance. "So what will the Sterling legacy be? A handful of glass towers with his name on them until a new, richer owner rebrands them?" "Does it matter?" Liam asked softly, closing the book and putting his arm around her. "He's part of a different story now. He's a footnote in yours." She smiled, a deep, genuine smile of contentment. The ghost of Richard Sterling no longer had any power. He was just a man in a lonely tower, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. Her life was here, in this room, filled with love, purpose, and the quiet, steady work of building a different kind of legacy. It wasn't a legacy to be carved in stone or emblazoned in gold, but one to be felt in the brushstrokes of a young artist given their first chance, in the halls of a hospital wing filled with hope, and in the shared quiet moments of a life beautifully and finally her own. What a story of poetic justice. It's a powerful reminder that true worth isn't measured by the size of your bank account or the volume of your voice, but by the content of your character and the quiet impact you have on the world. Leora's journey from being a trophy wife to a celebrated artist and philanthropist shows that the most brilliant comebacks are forged in resilience and authenticity. Richard Sterling learned the hard way that while money can buy attention, it can never buy respect. The spotlight he craved so much only ended up exposing his own deep-seated insecurities to the world. What did you think of Liam's ultimate power move? Was it the auction or the speech that delivered the final blow? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of karmic retribution and triumphant revenge, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good story, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of justice and drama. Thank you for listening.